Our brains are terribly misunderstood. And one of the big concepts that we're missing out on is the possibility of increasing our mental strength, our mental capacity. We absolutely get it for physical strength. We know exactly what to do to become physically healthy and physically strong. But with mental health, we assume there's a problem. And then we assume that at best, we can just do things to cope with that problem. Well, that's not the case. In the same way as you can increase your physical strength, you can increase your mental strength. And to do that, you need to increase your mental capacity. When we're overwhelmed, we've got very little capacity. When we're stressed, we've run out of capacity. When we can't read properly or can't concentrate or can't make decisions because we're procrastinating, all of those things that limit us can be directly attributed to our level of mental capacity. Now, this is a completely new concept, and maybe you've never thought of it, but I want you to start imagining the implications for increasing the amount of brain space you have, the space you have in your brain to deal with whatever life is throwing at you or whatever you want to pursue in life. We're held back when we run out of mental space. We feel terrible. We feel low. We feel sad. We feel overwhelmed. We stop making decisions, and so on and so on. So there's two fundamental reasons why our mental capacity is impaired, is reduced. When we are very young, when we're babies, maybe even at pregnancy, if something goes wrong in pregnancy, something goes wrong at birth, if you need to use forceps or the cord is around the baby's neck, things go wrong in the early days, weeks and months and years of a child's life. Anything where that child's brain is not able to predict the outcome, it creates what's known as a trauma. It creates a trigger. The brain loves to know what's happening next. And if a baby goes right through pregnancy and birth and early childhood, absolutely perfectly nurtured and nothing ever goes wrong, that child will go right through life with a glass half full attitude, able to learn, able to behave, able to enjoy life with very positive outlooks and very positive attitudes. That's fine. Unfortunately, that's rarely the case, because most of us at some point during that pregnancy and early months and years of our life, something will go wrong. Sometimes it's because of negligence, but very often it's not because of negligence. You know, if a mother is taken ill a few days after the child's life, which was a case of someone I was working with a couple of days ago, mother was taken ill, was in hospital, that young baby had just got used to the mother's smell and touch and so on. Suddenly the mother was gone. The baby had no clue what was happening. And it left that baby with a trauma that became a trigger that had all sorts of implications. Sometimes it's because a parent is a drug addict or an alcoholic. So there are all sorts of situations which can create a trauma in the brain of that baby. When trauma happens, whatever it is, it affects a few things. Very often, it stunts the development of the very bit of the brain that makes the connections, that makes things easy, or not, as the case may be. Our part of the brain is called the cerebellum. It's small, it's only 10% of the brain, but it's the master junction box. Some neuroscientists call it the brain within the brain. It's got 3/4 of all our brain cells. Yes, in that tiny bit at the back of the brain. It's the bit that makes connections between different parts of the brain and makes connections between the brain and the body. So it's hugely important. But if you stunt the development of that, it means that certain types of skill may not be completely finished off. And when I talk about skills, I'm talking about the things that we need to make life easy. When we stand up, we're using all sorts of subconscious skills that enable us to stand up without having to think. When we drive a car, when we ride a bike, when we socialize. Right now I'm using skills, what information would be useful to you? That's all in my subconscious. So all of the things that we don't think about that make life easy are developed by this all-important cerebellum. And the cerebellum can get stunted by adverse childhood experiences. So if it's development, it's stunted, certain types of skill don't develop. So for instance, some of us might be useless at maths, others are great. Some of us might be useless at art, others are great. Some of us might be useless at public speaking, and others are great. All of the myriad of skills are determined by how the cerebellum is itself developed. So any form of adverse childhood experience or trauma can stunt the development of the cerebellum, and it makes it kind of eccentric. So some parts are okay and some parts are underdeveloped. A very common example is eye tracking. About 1 in 4 have incompletely developed eye tracking. Can they see? Yep, they can see fine. But when they need to be able to see with the precision that makes reading easy, they haven't got that precision because the cerebellum hasn't fully finished off, fully automatized the skill of moving the eyes smoothly so that they find reading easy. So when we study those who struggle with reading, we find their eye tracking is all over the place. No wonder reading is hard work. Same is true of auditory processing. Some can't listen for long periods because the very process of turning the sound waves that go into their ears into thoughts that are comprehended isn't fully developed. It isn't automatic. So after a few minutes, they're working so hard because they have to put an extra process in to enable them to listen and comprehend. For some, it's physical clumsiness. They're physically clumsy because the skills of perfectly automated, controlled coordination of their muscles and joints isn't itself fully developed. So there's all sorts of things. Some have poor social skills. They can't read body language and faces very well. That's a skill that hasn't fully developed. So all of those attributes that limit us very often come back to how the cerebellum was developed and whether or not the cerebellum itself was stunted in its development. So that's one of the things that can come from early childhood adverse experiences or traumas. But the second is traumas create triggers. So how does that happen? Well, the very things that worry us, that put us into fight or flight, that put us into a high level of anxiety or hyper-alertness, those things are created by the adverse childhood experience. When the child cannot understand what is happening next, it remembers what was happening at the time, not in words, but all of the senses, what you were seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching. All of those sensory bits of information are stored and linked to an alarm system. And when that alarm goes off because you're in a situation very similar to something else that happened before, it doesn't tell you in words, this is why you've become hypervigilant, this is why you've gone into panic. It just does it. It hands over control to the reptilian brain, which is there for our survival. But very often, of course, these alarms go off. More than 99% of the time, these alarms are going off when they're false. There is no real threat, but something has reminded the brain that the situation that existed when you first had that trauma has just happened again. It assumes the worst, and it puts you into a highly anxious state, a very stressed state. Those alarms are created during our rapid eye movement sleep. It's a fascinating process. So when we sleep during the rapid eye movement stage, if something has happened during the day that the brain didn't know the outcome of, it links it to a trigger. And it stays there, unless you do something about it, it stays there for the rest of your life as a permanent trigger. So that's the second thing that can happen from adverse childhood experiences. Triggers that give you high levels of stress and anxiety. But there's a third thing. A young baby or child that has to fend for his or herself, has to solve problems because something is happening that the brain has no answer to, the brain doesn't know the outcome of. That can develop a creativity that will actually help them in life. Yes, it's going to do the other things as well. It's going to stunt the development of the cerebellum potentially, so some skills aren't fully developed. It can create triggers, but it can, and often does, create creativity. Something that is very obvious in those with ADHD symptoms. So trauma can cause some positive things as well. Now, it doesn't always create creativity. It doesn't always create a degree of genius. Sometimes it creates a victim mentality. So all of these things are possible, and all of these things go right through your life. It marks you. It makes it part of your character. Yeah, it's how we think of people. But it's really happening, and in many cases, the implications are very serious. So adverse childhood experiences impact our life set the tone of our character for the whole of our lives. Can it be changed? Yes, absolutely. But that's a whole different topic. So the implications of trauma or adverse childhood experiences is that you get these triggers. And if they're triggers that are going to go off frequently with false alarms right through your life and put you into a high state of stress, of anxiety, of overload, then when that happens, your brain gets flooded with cortisol. And big chunks of your brain are no longer available for sometimes a couple of hours or more until that cortisol dissipates, because your brain has been put ready to fight or flee. Anything else that you're trying to do is irrelevant. It's not as important. It becomes very low priority because the prioritization is, let's save your life, even if it is, as you know, a false alarm. But when that happens, even if someone is saying to you, oh, it's going to be all right, don't worry, pull yourself together. You can't even process what you're trying to listen to, because all of the prioritization is controlled by the reptilian part of your brain, which is all about your survival. So there's two big reasons why your mental capacity could be reduced. One is the underdevelopment of your cerebellum. So those key skills, those key processes which make life easy haven't all been finished off. And some of them, when they are not finished off, they require what's called conscious compensation. So for instance, when you're learning to ride a bike, you know what to do, but because the skill hasn't been fully developed, your thinking brain is very, very involved with helping you try to ride a bike. Now, the trouble with that is it fills up this precious space. But the second problem is whatever you process in your thinking brain is about 100,000 times slower than up in your cortex. You can only, in fact, ride your bike when the cerebellum has turned all of the things you're thinking about how you ride your bike, into a process that's up in your cortex, so you don't have to think about it. It's only then do you stop, fall off and bruising your knees. So the process of the cerebellum in creating skills that make life easy is crucial. When the cerebellum is itself stunted in its development, then your thinking brain is constantly going to be full of stuff that actually shouldn't be there. That is reducing your mental capacity. When you've got stressors, when you've got traumas, which create triggers and go off frequently, your brain is going to be often flooded with cortisol, which stops parts of the brain working and reducing your mental capacity. So there's two fundamentally important things that are reducing your mental capacity every day of your life. We've had to get used to just coping with limitations in our brain. If it's a limitation with reading, okay, you go through your life without reading very much. No one has thought about the possibility of dealing with the development of the cerebellum, which could have and should have created the automaticity in your eye movement skills that would have made reading easy. Well, that is possible these days. Likewise with auditory processing. If some folk can't listen for long, they've assumed they have to go through the rest of their lives coping with that limitation. If some people, and there's a few, that can't ride a bike, they never develop the automaticity of balance and coordination. If that happens, they assume they're not going to ride a bike the whole of their lives. So all of those limitations that we've learned to live with are the cause of that stunted development of the cerebellum itself. Today, those things can be addressed. The limitations that come from those triggers, that has a devastating effect on many people's lives, and it seems to be more popular now than ever since the COVID lockdowns. A higher proportion of people are struggling with stress, with high levels of anxiety and overwhelm and overload, all because that plethora of triggers, maybe the ones that started in early childhood, have created a whole avalanche of other triggers. So every day you're experiencing high levels of stress, of overload, which is hampering your performance, hampering your enjoyment of life, and filling your brain with cortisol. Well, if that's been happening, there are some tools that you can use to deal with that too. And in the same way as the creation of those triggers was during your rapid eye movement sleep, so there's also a process that replicates that librarian process that first created it that can replace the connections to the trigger that sets the alarm off and replaces it with a connection to a regular memory. And that process is called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's powerful. Not enough people know about it. It's not as accessible as easily as it could and should be because so many people need it, but it's powerful and it's very effective. And if you do that process of EMDR when your brain is highly neuroplastic, then the power to correct the original errors in the memory function is quick and it's highly effective. So look into these things. There's hope around today that wasn't around even 10 years ago. It's an exciting point in neuroscience and it's an exciting point for mankind. So if you are struggling with limitations for whatever reason, because your cerebellum hasn't been fully developed and some of your key skills stop you performing as efficiently and as easily and as naturally as you would like, have a look at correcting the root cause of that. If you struggle with emotional overload, with overwhelm, with high levels of stress, with procrastination, those have all come as a direct result of the various triggers that have left you plagued with high levels of anxiety. That can be dealt with. Look at EMDR. Look at combining it with neuroplasticity. These are incredibly powerful, life-changing tools. We live in a great age. We live surrounded by more hope than ever. It's simply that all of the neuroscience that creates that hope isn't reaching people fast enough. Well, it's reached you today.